I'm Don Ennis.
I'm Karleigh Chardonnay Webb.
And you're in the Transporter Room. This is not only a podcast this week, but we're on the Outsports YouTube channel. So if you want to watch as well as listen, you have a choice. Karleigh, our special guest this week, we're beaming up Whipping Girl author Julia Serano, who has a new book out. She is a biologist. She is an acclaimed writer, and she also just happens to be a transgender woman. I am just so chuffed about getting her on this show, but we've got some news to talk about. What was the latest that you heard, Karleigh? There was an action in Texas today?
HB 1646 passes through the Texas Senate. It's now going back to the House. And if it passes in the House, then it goes to the governor's desk. And simply put, this bill's ugly. Because this bill basically says if you are a healthcare, not only if you're a healthcare worker and you help and you give affirming care to transgender youth, we're going to throw you in jail. We're going to fine you. And if you're a parent who is supporting their child, you could have your children taken away because that's called child abuse in the great state of Texas. Right now, Monica Roberts is rolling in her grave. She's probably up there cussing right now, and rightfully so. This is horrible.
You know what really shocked me? I saw an AP story, and it was about how Alabama and the other states who have already passed anti-trans laws have seen no repercussions. No businesses boycotting, no people, celebrities marching. It's not like North Carolina all those years ago. This is just basically being allowed. Maybe when it goes to court, maybe then there'll be some action. But I was just shocked that basically everyone's going ho-hum.
Yeah. And that's the only people that haven't gone, the only people that have gone at least just ho is the NCAA.
Yes. And they even backtracked on that, saying they haven't made any decisions. They're willing to look at it, but I don't know. I'm just waiting for that other shoe to drop. There was good news over the week. Connecticut, the federal judge, he dismissed the case filed by Alliance Defending Freedom, and that's a huge victory for trans athletes in Connecticut. And now, of course, ADF wants to appeal.
Well, of course they do.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, of course they do. They're going to keep at it. And personally, I'd like to see them leave Connecticut and not come back. I mean,
that's what the governor said.
I mean, that's what Ned Lamont did say, quote, "butt out." And yeah. I'd be in total agreement with that. But there's something that's been on my mind about this, Dawn, and I know the ADF won't do it, but I'm going to tell Christina Holcomb right now. There are two girls from my state. Their names are Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller, and I think you owe them a public apology.
Well, in fact, they did it again in their statement. They called them males.
Yes, and I wouldn't be. I'll tell, if I was either one of them's father, I'd be talking to lawyers and saying, no, defamation of character suit.
No, not yet.
I would go both guns and say, look, I'm going to do to you what a lot of people did to the Klan. I'm going to let's defund transphobia.
Well, I can only say
for that.
I spoke to Mr. Yearwood, and Rashawn told me for an Outsports story that, for once at least a marginalized group was recognized and respected by this decision. But I think he wants Andrea to go on with her life.
Mm-hmm.
She's not pursuing sports anymore. She wants to pursue a degree.
Mm-hmm.
She should be left alone. Why keep dragging her name through this? She's not competing anymore. And they keep lying about how they won all these medals and stole scholarships and everything else. And it's just all bull.
And I agree. And on that one, I can agree and I can understand. Although I'll admit, I look forward to a day, maybe in the future, when Andrea and I are doing a 10K together. I'm gonna
cheer you on to the finish line.
I'm gonna call that right. Hey, Andrea, you and I 5K sometime, or just hang out in the track and work out so I can eat your dust. I mean, just to say I raced Andrea Yearwood, I would like that. But seriously,
I bet you still could do it. Yeah.
A little note about Texas, real quick.
Yeah, what's that?
One of the cities going for Super Bowl 56 is Dallas.
Oh,
the
NFL should not be allowed.
I would like to. I mean, in my dream world, in my smells like teen utopia, I would love it if the NFL said, if Texas passed that law, you'll never see a Super Bowl in Texas again.
Well,
I
let's hope.
know. I know it's a long shot and possibility, but I would like to see that. I'd like to see some people. I'd love to see, say, a Mercedes-Benz who has a major facility that builds a lot of cars in Alabama say, auf Wiedersehen in Alabama, we're leaving. I would like that.
Well, we also have some really tragic news to report. More trans murders, and it's 2021 is on track to be worse than the worst year ever, 2020. We had three more in just the last couple of days. And, it just goes to prove that living your life authentically can be a death sentence. And this is why some Black trans women never even see 35.
You know what I'm going to say about this. And
yes,
it's ridiculous.
I
do. It is. I get scared when I read those for two reasons. One, I see people looking like me dying, and number two, I'm afraid it could be me. And just a note for anybody listening who comes to my Twitter page, I don't want to hear any anti-sex worker crap. I don't want to hear any slut shaming. No, don't excuse this. It's time, especially in my community among Black folks. We need to be talking about this because this is a problem.
Yeah.
I didn't give up my Blackness because I decided to pursue my truth of who I am and my gender identity. I'm getting sick and tired of people just sweeping this stuff under the rug. We need to be dealing with this, and not just here, but in all our communities. Anti-LGBTQ violence is violence, whether it's the physical violence on our streets, whether it's economic violence, or whether it's the violence of people like the ADF and it seems the legislature in the state of Texas.
Sure.
And
Misgendering is violence too.
Yes.
And, be Black and be proud, Karleigh. And I support you, and I want to amplify your voice.
Well, yes, but my thing is, being Black and being trans, they are not exclusive.
No.
You can be both, and I am both, and it's
time
people started. We got to give it to him here. This is getting ridiculous, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse, and it seems like every year we've been saying that for the past 5 years now. We're on pace for the worst year ever. We're on pace. We've already been through one brutal thing for LGBTQ people, which is this pandemic.
Well, one of the wonderful parts of the book Whipping Girl, which I happen to have right here, is when Julia Serano talks about the murder of a woman in Boston and how that really catapulted our Trans Day of Remembrance. And I'd like you to set coordinates right now for Oakland, California, where Julia Serano is going to beam up to the transporter room.
Getting a lock on the home city of Trans Lifeline, Oakland, California. One to beam up, energize.
Welcome, Julia Serano. Hey, Julia.
Got to mute.
I want to get a shirt that says,
there we go.
You're muted. That seems to be the 2020 phrase, right? You're muted.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. I was doing the joke about, should I be doing this for the transporter beams? But, yeah.
Or you could do one of these,
Yeah.
Pop up.
Julia
Serano, thank you for joining us in the transporter room. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Well, I was just referring to a murder that you will know all too well, and friends of mine who were related to the victim and who saw that terrible crime and said, we've got to do something. We've got to make a statement. Would you tell us a little bit about that for folks who may not know?
So you said Boston. I remember writing about.
Sorry, I was
Guanajuato in Newark, California. Yeah, that was very mobilizing, and I will say there were numerous murders before then that were very mobilizing to trans communities, especially. I transitioned in 2001, and so a lot of 1990s activism, amongst the many things that 1990s activists did, a lot of it was starting to organize around and raise attention with regards to transphobic violence and the murder of trans people. And here locally, it was actually like right shortly after I transitioned, Gwen Araujo was a teenager who was not just murdered for being trans, but it was, I think people are familiar with, or more familiar with the movie Boys
There was a
Don't
movie
Cry,
based on her life, right?
about Brandon Tina is Boys
Oh,
Don't
of course.
Cry. It was
course.
kind of a similar thing in that it was a trans teenager just being their genuine self, who upon kind of it being discovered that she was trans, was just really brutally murdered. And it was also, it became a famous or infamous case because it was, I think, the last one in California that the defendants used the trans panic defense.
Yeah.
Where they basically said, apparently, and I will use the word alleged because I don't know all the facts, etc. But allegedly, I think at least one of the people who murdered her had been intimate with her. And so that was some of the impetus there. So they claimed it was trans panic that once they found out. I think it was probably the last one, last time that was used in California, because shortly thereafter, a law was passed saying that you can't use that defense anymore. So,
well, yeah, I was thinking of one in Boston that preceded it, but I'm blanking on the name. But I know the Gwen story was actually made into a movie as well. I think it was My Name is Gwen or something along those lines. But such a tragedy whenever these things occur, and they're still occurring. And I was wondering about how they affect you personally, knowing that it was so close to your transition time that the Gwen murder happened.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the Gwen Araujo murder hit me the most personally. Like they're all tragic. It's hard to be a human being, let alone a trans human being, and not feel emotionally impacted by these events when they happen.
Sure.
The Gwen Araujo one was very close to me because it was shortly after I had come out. At the time, I was performing a ton. I was performing as a musician, and I was also around that time I started doing slam poetry. So I was basically getting up on stage a couple nights a week, and my slam poetry was all total trans slam poetry. So I was basically outing myself to people, just in these bars doing slam poetry events. And then I'd be like walking back to my car being like, holy shit, I hope nobody is, like just wrong person, wrong situation. That's what a lot of these
You had to look over your shoulder, right?
Yeah. And sorry, I hope it was okay that what I said there. I don't know if
it's 100% okay what you said, but what I think is interesting.
That's fine. Just
one of my favorite parts in the book is when you talk about a few months after you had started on hormones, and your hair was long. You'd already been mammed a couple of times, and you suddenly noticed that you were in the world of women by people looking at you and being closer to you and treating you just the way you should be in your head. And that must have been at the year 2000. That must have been an amazing experience. You're a pioneer.
Thank you. I appreciate that. There's also I felt at the time that there are all these pioneers before me. I mentioned activists from the 90s, but we have a long history. There are many people who transitioned before me. It was definitely, I think it was it was different in the respect that there was so little trans awareness, that a lot of times when I was explaining to people what was happening, they just didn't know. I'd be like, I'm transgender, and they'd be like, what? I'd be like, I'm a transsexual, and they'd be like, what? And I'd literally have to say to them, I was born a male and now I'm a female. Obviously that's not language I would use.
You had to hit him over the head with it, right?
But I really did a lot of times, because there was not very much awareness then. But especially living right now, especially kind of in this world of backlash we're having, in some ways, I think it kind of made it easier. I mean, it made it harder in a lot of ways to not be able to connect with people and to say, you know, to have them understand immediately, like who I was or what I was going through, but also to just, it didn't cross people's minds that they would come across a trans person, or at least most people's minds. And so that in some ways made it safer, especially today where there's so much backlash and animosity, and you hear stories all the time, not just of trans people being harassed in, like, say, restrooms or locker rooms, but like cis women who just look gender nonconforming, experiencing the same thing. So in some ways it was hard. In some ways, maybe a little bit easier in other ways. And that's sad that that's it, because for a while it looked like we were just making some progress, but I feel like we're very much in a backlash now. So it's kind of depressing that that's the case.
Well, most recently in Medium, you wrote about this backlash in a number of ways. So from your view, what is really going on with the demonization of quote unquote, ooh, scary transgender activist? What's the real, in your view, from all your experience, right, writing, speaking, etc., from your view, what is this narrative really about?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. So there's a history to it that I wrote about in my most recent Medium piece, but I will point out that some news organization this weekend, I think people might be familiar with the fact that Caitlyn Jenner, who is not a lot of
running
ours
for governor,
not a lot of ours favorite trans person, is running for governor, and some news organization referred to her as transgender activist Caitlyn Jenner.
Oh,
It's just like, yeah, I mean, like, never was a transgender activist, just a celebrity trans person. But
celebrity's the best word for her, really.
yeah,
You know?
and there's just this, people like to stick activists on in feeling like it invalidates you. I mean, I think in a lot of people's minds, if you're an activist, that means you're a little bit, you know, radical or out of control. And you know, I mean, what activists try to do is activists try to change people's minds and change the world, which is what a lot of people are doing, right? So I don't know why people like think that calling us an activist should be bad, but it is in their mind.
I remember this guy was a Chicago activist. His name was Barack Obama, and he became a senator.
Like, he was president many years into his presidency. They were still bringing up that he was like a community activist,
organizer.
Yeah, organizer.
Yeah.
But that's one thing I'm not. But you know, it goes into that old saying. You know, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. In some ways, that's the way I kind of see it, because, for example, Julia, when you came out, a lot of people was like, trans what? And then all of a sudden they're like, and for a while we still were the butt of jokes. And again, we've always been a butt of jokes ever since Uncle Milton Berle. But now we're at that point where, do you think now we've really gotten to the point where now they're fighting us?
Yeah. And I think that there are a couple things that have happened. I think from an evangelical perspective, like the conservative right wing in this country, a lot of this is very clearly their response to feeling like they lost fighting same-sex marriage and gays in the military. Like they lost the fight on gays. I'm using that in scare quotes. And so there has been a very clear shift away from them targeting gays and lesbians. They don't really mention bisexuals a lot, but they've stopped targeting sexual orientation as much and have focused a lot more on trans people, just because we seem to be an easier target for them. We're either scarier or newer, and we can talk about like the potential reasons why, but they very clearly have decided to change their focus directly towards us. Yeah.
Well, Whipping Girl was really important to me. That and Jenny Boylan, She's Not There. And it was so important that the first edition is now in the hands of another trans woman who was looking for guidance, looking for help. And I gave away my first copy, but then I got the second one when it came out 6 years ago now. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to update the book in 2015. And I want to hear about your new book too.
Sure, yeah. So the Whipping Girl update, that was from conversations with my publisher, because it was getting close to being like, I think the second edition came out a year before the 10th anniversary, but it was like right around that time. And so they approached me about it. And it really made sense to write, especially for me, what the addition to it is I wrote a preface.
Yes.
That's looking back at it, that I think explains not only why, like how the book came to be, and not only all the huge changes in trans history that happened just in that short 10 years-ish. But I also got to explain kind of where the book was coming from, because I think a lot of what I said still remains true, is fairly universal about trans experiences, especially for those of us on the like trans female, trans feminine spectrum of the community. But also some of the language has shifted quite a bit. And so it gave me a chance to explain, for instance, in the subtitle, I describe myself as a transsexual woman.
Right.
And I know a lot of times people nowadays are like, the word transsexual to them sounds old, or it sounds pathological.
Sounds like Renee Richards or something, you know?
Yeah. But so when I was writing it though, that was important because there was a lot of the trans activists out of the 1990s, a lot of whom had taken steps to transition. They might be non-binary, but like it was important that how they moved through the world and everything. And when I came out a little bit later, it was kind of like the height of, there's a lot of like queer theory, and there are a lot of people who were not how we would describe the word trans now, who are kind of claiming that space. And I'm all for people being non-binary. I'm all for people being gender non-conforming. I'm for people doing drag. I think it's all great. But there was this real sense of what trans was blurring the lines. And I'm like, yeah, well, some of us actually have this experience where we understand ourselves to be a gender and we become that gender. Sometimes social transition or physical transition, but I was trying to articulate some of those experiences, and so it felt necessary to use that word. So that's like one example of like language that I use in the book, and I explain why I use it in the book now with the preface. And I think anyone who's been in the trans community, once you're in the trans community for more than a couple of years, you realize that language is always shifting.
Yes.
That
like
words that are
sand.
very, and so if you really, really like a particular term, it could like go out of favor really quickly and then come back a couple of years later. So
quick follow-up, what's the new book?
The new book, I have it right here. This is
good.
Yes. So this is
show
my
us
first...
again. I want to see.
Okay. And yes, that is a banana slug on a magic wand. Although it's actually a magic cat, so you can't sue me for this, people. Anyway, so it's called 99 Erics, a cat cataclysm faux novel. And so it's my first work of fiction. And basically it's told from the perspective of Cat Cataclysm, who just so happens to be a bisexual woman living in Oakland, California, who's trying to write her first novel. Any resemblance to the author
sounds like someone I might know.
Yes, is coincidental, perhaps. No, but actually, the book is, I like to describe it as silly, surreal, and sex positive. And the kind of the ridiculous premise of it is that Cat wants to write a novel, and for reasons that are explained early on in the book, she decides to date 99 different people named Eric. And then that's going to be what her novel's about. So part of the book is her writing the book. So a lot of it breaks the fourth wall that she's talking about writing the book you're reading. And then some of it, the conceit of having 99 Erics is that some of the chapters are just her on dates with these various people. And so
Named
anything, and anything that I wanted to like satirize or kind of have fun with, I was able to like do it by just putting her in the same room as some person and having the conversation go in that direction.
How delightful. Oh.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to write. And it's been getting good responses. It actually is a finalist for
nomination.
Yeah, it's a finalist for the Publishing Triangle's debut fiction award.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
We hope you win.
I hope so too, but it's also great to just be a finalist. I'm going to be in a reading on May 10th.
Where, in Oakland?
No, well, it's on Zoom.
Oh, still, that's right. We're still
online.
in COVID. I'm fully vaccinated now, and I don't have to wear my mask outside. So I just feel like this new freedom. Like I was in a mall parking lot today. I was like, I don't have to put my mask until I get to the mall, and I have to put my mask on.
Yeah. Well, this actually turns out good for me because I think normally their award ceremonies are in New York, which would be I wouldn't be able to make it out there at this particular time, but
I get it.
It's fairly easy to just zoom in. So, but yeah, so that's kind of the. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just wondering. Oh, are you going to eventually, in a spoken word piece, break this work down the way you broke down Little Red Corvette? I'm just wondering. Is there an analysis breakdown of this book coming?
You will be very happy to know that. So for those who don't know what Karleigh is referencing, I have in one of my Cat Cataclysm chapbook, I have a piece. It's basically an open letter to Prince that kind of is from a confused listener trying to like talk about what's so confusing about Prince's Little Red Corvette. And actually that comes up in the book. I use a little snippet of it where Kat kind of makes some of those same jokes. So yeah.
I kept mentioning Kat, and my cat said she wanted to be part of this. So
okay. Hi, Kat.
Meet Faith.
Oh, look at Faith.
Oh, Faith doesn't want to be on TV.
I didn't know you had kitties.
Oh my goodness.
I just thought you were a dog person. So
I have a dog and a cat. The cat belonged to my late wife, and she was appropriately named Faith. And unfortunately lost the wife, but we kept the cat. So tell me this, when you are writing, are you the kind of writer who writes in longhand? Do you write on a computer? What's your muse? How do you do it? My friend Jenny Boylan, who's written a whole ton of books, she writes like 1,000 words a day, every day in the morning, and then sometimes goes back to it. What's your method?
Yeah, so I'm all computer. I had written before I started writing. When I really started writing, it was already a kind of computer world. So I do have journals, and so if I'm kind of out and about somewhere, sometimes I'll pull out a journal and do longhand. I mostly just write on the computer. And I wish I had the Jenny Boylan power of 1,000 words a day. I am a very slow writer. And that might be related to the fact I'm a very slow reader. I'm very slow at both things. And some of that might be a difference between fiction and nonfiction. I think.
Plus, you're also prolific on social media. You are constantly tweeting. You are constantly taking on the demons and tilting at windmills.
Yes, that's a habit. No, I've been doing that more. I mean, I tend to be on Twitter. That's like the social media platform I use. I'm on other ones, but I don't use them nearly as much. Especially over the last year, it's been really hard because of the backlash that we've been in, that I feel like there's always something outrageous. There's so much outrageous that's happening in the country in general, in the world in general. And then particularly within, kind of trans communities and the backlash that we've been talking about. So I do a bunch of that. That's kind of easier writing. I tend to be so also, especially when I'm writing nonfiction, that comes about very slowly. Yeah, I mean, I might just be a slow reader or a slow reader and writer, but I think also working through, this is what I find when I'm writing something. Sometimes I'm really excited and I get a lot down, or sometimes I already have it all planned out in my head and I write it. But a lot of times I have a general topic I want to write on, and as I'm writing, I'm always changing how I think I should say it or how I want to approach it. So for that reason, I tend to write fairly slowly when I'm writing something that I hope to be, like, say, an essay. So yeah, and I try to write every day, but I don't hold myself to that. And if I have days that I don't write anything, but I read a lot, I'm a big believer in the input-output idea, that there are some days that you have a lot of output, and then it's okay to have days where you're doing a lot of input. You're like reading things and listening to podcasts or taking in ideas. So
yeah,
I think
looking for inspiration,
Yes.
right? I teach at a local university here in Connecticut, and I tell my students, good writers read, good readers write.
Right.
And it's very important. Oh, we have a sound that says we have to take a break. When we come back, Karleigh's got an update on Charlie Martin. Plus, we found out Julia Serano is also a sci-fi fan. We'll be right back. You're in the Transporter Room. So we add the music later. Karleigh, would you welcome us back and give us your Charlie Martin update? Because we skipped it at the beginning and I don't want to miss out.
No problem. And also coming off of it, I have a question for Julia as well.
You should go right after that. Yes, please. I'll be quiet.
Oh, you quiet?
I'll try to be quiet.
Hey, you ding me about the same stuff. So you know what? And welcome back to the Transporter Room. Karleigh Chardonnay Webb, along with Dawn Ennis and Julia Serano, author, spoken word aficionado, sci-fi fan, and just general, like, trans bard, if you will, joining us. And again, honor to join us. And by the way, slow writers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your pen. Being a slow writer, I can also relate to that, because sometimes it takes me hours to get one good paragraph because it's a jumble up here. But before we go on, a little bit of news from the trans sports world. After all, we are the Transporter Room, and just this past weekend, while I was flat on my back, thanks Moderna, your favorite race car driver of mine, Charlie Martin, opening up the Brit Car Endurance Series season at good old Silverstone in England, and her and teammate Jack Bobby did something pretty sweet. They won.
Go, Charlie, go.
The opening race of the season, first of two on the day, and Charlie ran a great first stint. In fact, ran a pair of great first stints. Jack Bobby bought it home in the second half of the race, and they got a win. They got a nice win. They brought home some hardware and that great-looking red and black Praga they're driving. And then in the second race, Charlie went door handle to door handle with the defending series champion, and the defending series champion was forced to blink in a battle for position within the Praga category of the series. He was able to move the car up to second, and then Jack Bobby brought it home in the second race for a second. So a first and a second. Great podium start for Charlie Martin, and after a couple years in Flex and finding a seat, good to see her finding a home, finding a great team, and from what looks of it, possibly a championship year. So Charlie, good on you, and we're looking for more at Snetterton a couple weeks from now.
Read all about it in Outsports.com.
Exactly. But Julia, one thing, you've doing this writing, got the new novels out there, and it's getting some fine reviews. In fact, I can tell you right now, I'm going to order it because I'm looking forward to picking it up. Has writing and creating, in a sense, how much of a tonic does writing give you? How much does it give you any escape from tilting at the windmills on Twitter and dealing with the backlash and the more academic things you write? And also, how do you get your self-care during this time when it seems like the transgender community just continues to go through siege after siege after siege?
So true.
Yeah, that's a lot. So I would say that for one thing, I've always had creative outlets, and the other creative outlet I've had in my life has been music. And in fact, but like my main creative outlet was music for most of my time until shortly after I transitioned. Then that's when I got into spoken word and I started writing for the page more. I felt that, especially being trans and trying to want to say some complicated things about gender and sexuality and other things, that writing was more direct and gave me more words to use than, say, writing a short 3-minute song. And yeah, I definitely have always found kind of the need to try to get what's inside me out, and getting that onto the page or onto the computer screen it can be very relieving, cathartic. There can be a lot of good feelings with feeling like you've created something and now it's in the world. It doesn't necessarily always have to be that way. Sometimes there are times where I'm writing something and it's a real struggle, and when I'm done with it, I'm very grateful to be completely done with it and never want to see it again. That does happen sometimes, but I feel like I'm at my best writing when I'm really excited about what I'm writing, and I feel like getting that out of me and out into the world, that feels very relieving to me. And so there definitely is a part of self-care that is about getting what's inside of me out into the world. And then otherwise, sometimes stepping away is good too. I found myself, especially during the wake of the election here in the US, and the election being that was very very decisive, not divisive. It was divisive, but not because the election was divisive,
and definitive,
but because
right? Yeah.
people are divisive. Yeah, but it was a very definitive decision, and yet just the couple months that was all going on and stretched out, there were just points in time where I just like just pulled away from that. I want to be on top of the news, but sometimes it's okay to pull back and to just, just read something completely different or watch something on TV that's completely different and separate. So that can be really important. It's been hard, I think, for a lot of us, most of us, during the pandemic, in that things that I had in the past relied on for escape and self-care, whether that's getting together with friends and people in my life, whether it's just like going to the gym every once in a while and losing myself, like doing some laps in a swimming pool, like just losing all that has been hard, I think, for all of us. Like, that's not a me thing. I think that's a most of us thing.
I want to play word games with you. A word that is on your title of your subtitle of your book, and it's important, is femininity. And the book also talks about feminism. And it seems almost as if TERFs have taken the word feminism and turned it into a negative word. Before we started recording, we talked about how transgenderism is a word invented by trans people and also has been corrupted by enemies of trans people. And I was wondering, what's your thought process in terms of reclaiming words like, femininity, feminism, transgenderism?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think every word is a little bit different. This is my understanding of feminism, that it's a very broad movement that exists in order to challenge sexism, and sexism being double standards related to sex, gender, and sexuality. And feminism has been around a long time, and there are many different strands of it. And one tiny strand of it is what we have been calling trans-exclusive radical feminism, or which is more commonly amongst those who promote it, gender critical feminism. I think the problem is that for people who are not in feminism, that they can really be susceptible to the idea that it's transgender people versus feminists, right? And that's the battle that the TERFs, the gender critical people, want to have. They want to have feminism be theirs and trans people being on the outside destroying feminism. And if you actually talk to people who are involved in feminism, and I say this as someone who not only identifies as a feminist, but I spend a lot of times, I go to colleges, I'm invited by gender studies groups. I know a lot of people who actually in their real life do feminist work that doesn't involve anything about like saying bad things about trans people. They're doing real feminist work. And all of these people, what they're doing, it's not in any way in conflict with trans people or trans people's existence. And most feminists I know are pro-trans or trans inclusive. So I feel that in the case of feminism, that's a word I'm not going to let go of, because I don't think those people at all own it. Like that word existed before any of them were born. And most feminists are not transphobic. So just because they call themselves, you know, oh, we're feminists, that doesn't mean that A, you're right, or B, that the feminism you're doing is actually real, authentic, valuable, useful, productive feminism. Right?
But which wave are you? I've heard there are fourth wave and fifth wave, and I'm like, I can't keep track of it. I just know that I'm a feminist, and I'm raising my sons to be feminists too.
Yeah, I think the wave thing isn't as useful as it was. The way that I understood it, so first wave feminism is everything leading up to like, you know, like through the suffragettes. So like, I think first wave feminism is a very, a many decade period. And then second wave feminism referred to the feminism that came out of the 60s, 70s, 80s period, which I think generationally that might be thought of as like a boomer generation or people who predated the boomers. So it's like kind of like that generation. And then third wave was used a lot starting in the 80s through the 90s to mean a couple different things. It partially refers to the movement towards intersectionality, a lot of feminists of color, talking about the way in which you can't only talk about women, that feminism has to involve also challenging racism and classism.
One
and
more time
homophobia.
for the people in the back.
Yes. And this is a lot of the reason why the gender critical TERF people are bad feminists, because they are the least intersectional feminists that exist on the planet.
They're older, they're whiter, and they're hopefully going to die off someday.
Oh, there's young, don't get it, don't sleep. There's young TERFs.
I know. I'm not saying there aren't.
There are black TERFs. There are other TERFs of color.
Though. They are loud, but they are small. There are not as many as it's like that 1 million moms thing. It's really just one woman in Florida.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of gender critical identified people, especially in the UK.
Oh, it's very UK. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But I think a lot of it comes from sadly, I've been on a lot of their timelines because I hand block people. And so if I get mentions, I'll sometimes go through people's timelines. The people who are like really, really anti-trans, who call themselves gender critical, you go on their timelines and they're only talking about trans stuff. Like it's like literally only trans stuff. Like you go there and they aren't ever talking about like
feminism,
you know, choice, or they aren't talking about you know, any of the myriad issues that relate to sexism and women's experiences with sexism.
See, that's one of my pet peeves with them, especially when they talk about something I care about, which is sports. It's funny. They're jumping all over themselves to talk about, these biological males in sport. Yet none of y'all talk about things like more opportunities for women in athletics, better funding for women in athletics, better coverage for women in sport, more women as sports journalists, more women in front offices, more women in coaching, more women in administration. They never talk about that. And also, scratch a transphobe, you might find a racist. Look at Missouri. They have a bill that's going to ban transgender students from being a part of school sports, and they're hooking that bill up to making sure that no student can learn about the 1619 Project either. Like I said, scratch transphobe, you'll find a misogynist and a racist all at the same time.
Well, we have an opportunity here. We have a biologist who can tell us if the term biological male is an accurate term.
Yeah, they like to claim science is on their side. It's very clear and generally accepted, especially nowadays, that as with any field, there's like evolutions in the way people think about it. And I'm sure if you go back to like the 80s, 1980s, for example, a lot of people would look at trans women as biological males. A lot of biologists might do that. But nowadays, there's a lot more understanding of gender and sexual diversity, which includes people who are intersex, whose bodies or anatomies don't fit into what's considered standard for male or female. There's transgender people whose gender identities or gender expressions don't match what is socially expected for people based on your assigned sex or gender. And, you know, there's people who vary in their sexual orientations. There's a lot of awareness right now, especially in biology, that what sex is it's a complex trait, meaning there are a lot of different factors that go into it. We also know that there are a lot of, when you say sex, what are you talking about? You're talking about my chromosomes, are you talking about my genitals, are you talking about my hormones, aspects of my reproductive anatomy? Like that could mean a lot of things. And once you start looking at it like that, then it's really clear that a lot of people who we think of as cisgender, their sex would become under suspect because of the fact, oh, well, if, you know, to be a biological woman, you need to be able to like be pregnant and have children. It's like, well, yeah, there are a lot of cisgender women for whom that's not a possibility for them physically. And on top of that, it's like when we see people and when we categorize people, like walking down the street, if we see someone, when we categorize them, what we're usually basing it on is not chromosomes, not genitals. What we're doing is generally based on secondary sex characteristics, and which are malleable. And as those of us who have hormonally transitioned have experienced, it's like your secondary sex characteristics change. That's why
Yes.
when I walk down the street, as a general rule, people just, they don't see me as a biological woman. They just read me as female, just in the same way that if you're a cisgender woman, they just are picking up on clues. And there are a lot of problems built into that, obviously, because we tend to see people, we're socialized to see people in a very binary way as either, you know, men or women, right? So there are a lot of problems with that. But what that highlights is the fact that some aspects of sex, biological sex, is malleable. And for a lot of us who are trans, that our biological sex changes in a lot of ways. So it's just a very, it's a very futile argument to like try to call like trans women biological males and trans men biological females, because once you start looking at biology, it becomes really clear that biology is way more complex than that. Biology is not fully binary, and trans people's our biological sex changes, particularly if we're hormonally transitioning, right? So
Thank you for tackling that. And I think that everyone thinks that their high school education on biology was enough for them to become experts on biology. You know, I promised myself I was going to read too much from your book, but there was something in Whipping Girl that really stood out to me. And all these years later, I have you here now to finally talk about. And it's something that really follows up with what Karleigh was saying. Because transsexual and intersex people have virtually no voice in academic and political discourses on gender, our perspectives are easily overshadowed, even subsumed by those who have the academic credentials to position themselves as authorities on the subject. When I see a TV show, now I'm a former TV producer, I worked in television, in mainstream media for 30 years. And when I see them take on these issues about transgender, and there's not one trans person, the trans military ban, these issues along the states, they don't think that they need to have a trans person there representing our voice. And it drives me crazy. And I'm so glad you addressed that in your book, because it's so frustrating.
yeah. Yeah.
There's
I
nothing
don't
else to
even know
say.
what
Yeah.
to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. and that goes to the heart of, I think it's important. We throw around words. Throw around is like, I'm saying that kind of flippantly. Throw around words like transphobia, and people will all of a sudden be like,
I'm
"Oh,
not
well, I'm not
afraid.
afraid of trans people. I have trans friends and all that." It's like, yeah.
I
Okay.
have a black
But
friend too, I'm sure.
but
Yeah.
I think, well, I think that a lot of what's going on with regards to any type of phobia or ism, a lot of it is unconscious, and a lot of it can be found in how you would react to a particular situation under one circumstance versus another. The idea that you would have, say, we're doing with your sports show, like having a panel of people talk about, like, the lives of athletes, and to not have an athlete on seems like preposterous. How could you do a show about the life of athletes without having actual athletes be interviewed? Like,
or men talking about abortion.
Yeah. And so I think that once you frame it like that, people will often go, "Oh, okay, now I see." But it doesn't strike them at the time as weird, just because unconsciously they devalue us, or they see us as not authorities on our own life. And that is something that's still, I still see that all the time in articles about I don't want to get into specifics about specific writers who write really horrible articles about trans people, but you can see it sometimes where it's like, hey, you just did a 10,000 word article in a mainstream thing about like trans healthcare, and you didn't have interview any trans people. Like, how? How could you do that?
That's unfortunately par for the course.
No, I know.
It
I wrote a
really is.
rebuttal in USA Today because USA Today announced the Women's Sports Policy Working Group in an article that interviewed all these cisgender women talking about transgender athletes, and didn't talk to one trans person. So I petitioned to write a rebuttal, and they published it, which, thank goodness, we finally had a voice in USA Today. But it's so frustrating. Karleigh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's not that, because exactly, Dawn, what you wrote was beautiful, and you gave me a chance to read it before you submitted it on. And all that aside, I talk about the Cisgender Women's Sports Policy Working Group enough, but I wrote a very similar thing on Trans Day of Visibility, and talked about one of the things, Julia, I want you to ring in on this. At what point in all these stories and all the coverage in your mind, based on what you've seen, at what point will trans people ever fully be humanized in all this? Do I get to be human at some point? And if so, when do you see that point happening? Because right now, all these stories sound like Godzilla against Mechagodzilla in a lot of ways. They make us out to be monsters. When do I get to be human in all this?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Not funny, but basically the writer of really bad trans articles that I was subtweeting there, I was not specifically naming them, but mentioning their article. They, in a different article that they wrote about trans people, referred to, and this came out in like 2018, they referred to, like, people are familiar with all of the wonderful articles about transgender people and progress transgender people have made. And it was like, what are you talking about? Are you talking about like that 1 year period, 1.5 year period where like people were celebrating Laverne Cox, and then like Caitlyn Jenner transitioned a year later, like that
2014, 2015.
Yeah, exactly. That 1 year period, that was the transgender tipping point, because it was like there were a couple celebrity trans people, and we talked about celebrity trans people with regards to Caitlyn Jenner, like being very clear, Laverne Coxon is in a very different category as someone who has really done like a lot of amazing activist work, in addition to being a celebrity for being an amazing actor too, right? so putting that aside, just this idea that like people read a couple nice pieces about trans people, and particularly there's the whole like transgender journey kind of idea, which can happen in documentaries, it can happen in memoirs, it can be done well or poorly, right? Like you mentioned, you know, Jenny Boylan obviously writing a really amazing memoir. There can be like horrible documentaries of like, tonight on Nat Geo, we're going to bring you into the mysterious world of transgender people.
Let's look inside her closet. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
know. Oh.
so there, anyway, I think that for some people, that's all there is to trans people, is that trans people just have these stories. And then everything else about trans people is like serious minded cisgender people who really know what's going on, doing all the talking on our behalf. And it's endlessly frustrating. And there are definitely some signs of it being better. There are trans journalists who are writing and doing good work, and media outlets that will publish smart, factually correct articles about trans people. So unfortunately, there's still the exception, I fear. So, yeah.
Well, Karleigh mentioned Godzilla, so we're going to sort of segue now into the fantasy sci-fi world. So what's your thing? What do you groove on in terms of sci-fi?
So yeah, so my experience with sci-fi is when I was younger, that was really, those were the first books I really read for enjoyment. I can't remember everything that that I read back then. I remember like when I was in high school, Dune was like my very favorite book.
Sure.
And you know, I remember reading like Robert Heinlein.
Heinlein, yeah.
You know, I remember reading a bunch of sci-fi books. One that I really like that actually kind of partially inspired 99 Erics is I love the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series.
Yes, don't forget your towel.
Exactly. I used to describe 99 Erics as that it was like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy meets a Michelle T novel, except none of it happens in outer space, which in my mind kind of is like what it feels like. But I think the mixture, the Venn diagram of people who are really into Douglas Adams and people really into Michelle T, like barely touch, and I'm like one of the few people
You're right in the middle
at
there.
that intersection. But anyway, so like I really like that. And then since then, I don't do a lot of. I will occasionally read sci-fi, but for me, mostly, especially since I do so much writing and reading for things that I'm writing, a lot of my escapist stuff happens on TV or the movies, which are the exact same thing, particularly during a pandemic.
Yes.
So yeah, so I would say most of the stuff I'm familiar with nowadays is stuff that you will find on the TV screen in my apartment. I was in college when Next Generation happened. So there's kind of like the revival of all the Star Treks that then kind of went on into the early aughts. So I've definitely—
Or the zeros, as you call it. The zeros.
Yes, the zeros, yes. I sometimes say aughts now. I hated the word aughts. I would not use the word aughts at all during the aughts.
Yeah, I call them the 2000s, but you're certainly welcome to come up with your own.
Yeah, the zeros are good.
We're both Star Trek fans. I just recently became this year a writer for StarTrek.com. And I wrote about all the Discovery cast members. There are 6 of them who are LGBTQ and out, which is really crazy and amazing and wonderful. I'm working on 2 pieces right now. One is about when are they going to have a trans woman on any Star Trek? Just one somewhere who's regularly appearing, not just like a guest star. And the other is, which original series character would you want to go to Risa with? Karleigh, which one would you choose from the original series to go to Risa?
Oh, that's a dang good question.
Thank you. I pitched that and they loved it.
That is a dang good question. Where would I want to go? Not just anywhere, but to Risa.
See, I picked
Wow.
I picked Scotty because I figure He'll get me drunk. We'll have fun, and who will tell the story after? I don't care.
See, that's a tough one from original series.
Yes, original
I don't
series.
know. I'm torn on that one because part of me like, do I get Girls Weekend with the Uhura?
Yeah, going singing and dancing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Girls Weekend with the Uhura or Fun as Hell Weekend with Sulu.
Oh yeah.
I mean, one. Okay, I'll lean to Uhura because I could use. I mean, especially through this pandemic, could use the Girls Weekend, and besides, we could both bitch about everybody, especially Captain Kirk. I mean, you got to have the bitch session with wine and cheese. You must have it.
Plus, you both sing, which I love.
Yeah, which would mean we doing a lot of karaoke. No, it would be beyond
Karaoke, right?
We'd be putting on shows.
All right, Julia, you're on the spot. Would you have an original series character you would want to go to Risa with, the Pleasure Planet?
Yeah, see, that's hard with the original series because I've watched all them. I was like a kid when those were on. Those are always on in the background, and I
Yes.
only revisited them after I got into Star Trek Next Generation.
A lot of folks are like that.
Yeah, and so I don't find the characters from that show appealing. Like, I definitely like Spock a lot, but I don't know that he would be like the person to hang out with on like a pleasure planet.
No,
but
no,
like,
no, no.
Okay, then let's flip the script. Let's go Next Generation. Who would you go?
Okay.
Who would you go with next gen?
That's a good question. Yeah, that would be easier. Like, I mean, Guinan would be a lot of fun to
Oh,
like hang with.
yes.
Like, because you're talking about the stories, with like Scotty, Guinan would have all the stories. Plus, would be like a super fun hang.
I wouldn't go with Troy though, because Troy senses emotions, and I'd be worried about.
No, that would creep me out. I don't know why everyone else is just totally okay with her just like always sensing their emotions. That freaks me out.
Julia, how do you identify, by the way? Are you like Kat? Are you bisexual?
Oh yeah, I'm bisexual. Yes.
See, you know what's funny is that most people in the LGBT community, the majority are bisexual, and yet there's still this stigma of, well, that's just a phase, or you're just trying it out, or you're greedy. And I have found in my research and in my writing that there are more bisexuals than any other section of the LGBT community. And I sort of feel like I'm on that spectrum because I was only in love with one woman most of my life, and I only dated women. And since coming out, I've dated men, and I'm sort of torn as to where I land on that whole spectrum thing, but I'm pretty sure I'm probably going to end up on the bi side.
Yeah, I think that there are, I think that there are historical reasons why gay and lesbian people, particularly when to be out as gay or lesbian kind of meant that you were going to completely have this life that was almost totally in this gay and lesbian community, right? And I particularly in thinking about bisexuality and current debates about it, I think a lot about the idea of being culturally queer, in that there are bisexual people. All bisexual people are bisexual, right? So I'm not like gatekeeping bisexuality, but I do think that some of the debates that I've heard relate to, I think there's some of us, like I'm very culturally queer in that like my friends and who I hang out with and everything, it's like just a very, very queer segment of the community. It's a very open queer, there's trans people, but there's cis people. There are people who are there who are a queer couple, but if the average person walking down the street saw them, would assume they were heterosexual because they look heterosexual in their eyes, although maybe, neither of them is heterosexual, or maybe they're trans and they're queer in that way, right? So I do think that there's this idea, an old idea of bisexual people as during a time when you were either like in the queer community or you were in the straight community, where being bisexual is this idea that you could retreat to this safe straight community anytime you wanted to, which is a myth. Because the straight community is not necessarily safe for bisexual people. And I think that for a lot of people, those divisions are still there. But I do think there are sometimes people who are bisexual who might not have as much queer awareness as other people because they haven't been in queer communities a lot. But that should be okay because there are young, gay, lesbian, and trans people who don't have much experience with our community who are just getting involved in it, right? So I think that there should be some space for for people to be able to come into the community without immediately jumping to conclusions about what that means, particularly with regards to the idea that like, oh, you can leave whenever you want to because, you know, you have heterosexual privilege and all that stuff. So I talk about that a lot. My second book, Excluded, which is the book I come out as bi in. And Whipping Girl, I identify as lesbian, which was how I identified then. But anyway, I talk a lot about those dynamics in Excluded for those interested. So.
And we wish everyone who does identify as lesbian a happy Lesbian Visibility Week. And Karleigh, I asked the first question. You get to ask the last one.
Julia, first off, I want to say thank you for writing Whipping Girl. Because
and Excluded. And 99 Erics.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to 99 Erics, but especially that because when I went, the night I went to my first support group, way back around like 2012, someone told me if you really want to understand what's going on and the journey you could be taking, you need to read this book. And they let me borrow it. So in a lot of ways, thank you. In a small part because of Whipping Girl, I am happy to say I am here. And
yeah, thanks.
You have a second edition. Your second edition's been out for some time. And even now with so many changes in the community, even since the second edition came out, people, I even find myself recommending it. Dawn recommends it. People still recommend it. At my friendly neighborhood Pride Center, there's 3 copies on the shelf ready to check out, and it's always checked out. Newbies, people who've been in a while, whether you're late transition or early, wherever you are, people, it's still very much resonant. First, does it surprise you it's resonated as long as it had? And secondly, why do you think it has resonated as much as it has, even now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first, thank you for the kind words. And it's always, you know, I always feel honored when people say that the book was important and useful to them. I think when I was writing it at the time, I felt like I was writing the book, you know, because I had read trans themed books that were important to me that helped me figure out who I was. But I felt like there weren't any that I felt like talked about some of the things I wanted to talk about, which ended up being in the book. So I felt I was trying to write a book that I thought in my mind might help me back when I was younger. And so I'm always flattered when people say that that's what the book was for them. And so that's awesome. And thank you for that. And as far as, I think if I have to say, it's always hard to talk about, well, the reason why my book was so important is blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit hard to talk like in those terms. I think the one thing the book captured that I don't think books before it captured, and people have talked about it since, was specifically the intersection of not just being trans, which people had already talked about, but the intersection of the way in which being seen as trans feminine, how that is seen in a world that's misogynistic and sometimes very, very strongly anti-feminine in a world. And I talk about this in Whipping Girl, where even though in this world that we live in, people will at least give lip service to the idea that, well, yeah, women are men's equals. Like almost nobody is willing to say, yeah, femininity is masculinity's equal. And I think a lot of those ideas are, they appear everywhere. They appear in all of the old medical gatekeepers writings. which I talk about. They appear in all the old media depictions and some new ones as well.
Sure.
And so, yeah, so I think that is something that I touched on that other people have since written about and everything. But I think that was the one thing that I tried to do in that book that I think is the main reason why it resonates with people, even if, you know, the language or some of the terms I use might be a little bit, you know, not the language people are using today. The general ideas are continue to be true, sadly, that there's still just a lot of trans misogyny out there. And so that would be why I think the book resonated.
A quick follow-up to that before we let you go,
Sure.
because one thing that's near and dear to my heart, because when you said about femininity equaling to masculinity, that put a light bulb on my head. And I want to get this, especially as somebody who really lives at that intersection, being an athlete. When you listen to all these things in regards to trans people in sports, especially all that backlash that's come out, how much in your mind does what you just talked about play into that in regards to how we see feminine versus masculine in our society?
Sure, yeah. I think this is the thing that really strikes me, is that there are two ways that you can caricature trans women. And so one, the version that I see, especially with all the horrible trans sport, anti-trans propaganda that exists, is you can character trans women with the man in the dress, right? And you see a lot of these right-wing, the anti-trans propaganda that they'll just show, and I don't know how many of them are photoshopped or what they're trying to depict, whether they're depicting a especially masculine cisgender woman or whether the person is transgender, but it's this idea of this like giant man in a dress who's like invading women's spaces. But then the whole opposite of that is you can like mock trans women with, you know, what I talk about in the book is like kind of like the really, really hyper feminine caricature of trans women. Like, you know, I think a lot about the book not the movie Trans America, which was like a movie that won an Oscar in the early 2000s, I think. And the actor with Felicity Huffman is a cis woman, but like she was like always putting on clothing and her nails were always really done. And she was like tripping in heels. And it was like this whole joke.
Stereotype.
And it was a joke. It was a joke about femininity. Femininity was the joke, right? Like she was always putting on makeup. And so it is very striking that the two ways that we get smeared, trans women and people in the trans feminine spectrum, are as either hypermasculine man in a dress or as hyper feminine, frivolous, clueless woman wannabe, right? Like that's just
a caricature is what I was called when I first came out.
Yeah.
I heard that from someone very close to me, and it hurt me to know him.
And there's a lot of feminists, even way before our current TERFs situation, feminists saying, oh, well, like, you know, trans women are parodies of women, right?
Imitations,
Yeah. So both those really resonate with people. And I think they're both trans misogynistic in different ways. Right.
And misogynistic too. I mean, honestly, it's misogyny at its core. Karleigh and I talked about this a million times on this podcast, that transphobia is misogyny.
Yes, it is. And but at the same time, I also find it very contradictory. On when I'm either this dominating automaton machine that's going to take all all those cute little girls' opportunities away, or I'm a total ditz. It can't be both.
Pick one.
It can't be both. Yeah, I know. Pick a lane. I mean, that's the one thing that gets me about this whole discourse, is that pick a lane. I can't be, but also in a sense, women have. I asked the question in part because cisgender women in sports get tarred with the same brush.
Yes.
It happened.
Those who are male appearing, masculine.
Yes, it's happened from Babe Didrikson all the way to Serena Williams.
Sure.
And
Well,
again, it goes back to one question: when do I ever get any humanity from this deal, or is humanity something I'm going to have to go out there and take? What'll it be?
Yeah.
I don't know if Julia can answer that one, but I will ask Julia, what's your recommendation? Do we march in the streets? Do we keep writing? Do we hold fast? Do we go to the polls, run for office? What's your solution in your mind in terms of where does this go? Where does this end? How do we win?
Yeah. So I think in general, I think a lot of times people want activism. Like a lot of times people say, oh, activists should do this and shouldn't do that. And I think that's kind of ridiculous because for one thing, there's no like chief trans activist like who's giving us marching orders. It's just individual people. And so, there are people that I think it's really cool. They're like trans people who are running for office, which I can't imagine myself ever wanting to do. But like I can do this thing. I'm a good writer and I can write. That's the thing I can do. And everyone has their own little niche. Like there's some things that I'm very fascinated by, like particularly like a lot of trans related diagnoses and theories that maybe because I came out of a science background, like I write disproportionately about those. But that's fine because other people like you all are doing like trans sports, and that's another important facet. And then there are other people who are like writing about other issues or doing more kind of in the streets sort of activism. So I think we should be doing all of it. As for how it all turns out, I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic, and I say cautiously optimistic because it's a very dark time right now. Just the map of how many states are putting out anti-trans laws or proposing them, not just about sports, but especially the trans healthcare related ones are like hard, like basically we're going to outlaw healthcare for you. And if your parents try to get you that healthcare, we'll label them child abusers and like you could be taken away from them. Like that's just like really beyond the pale. But I think this is what I feel has changed. And maybe I'm overly optimistic here, but I felt like a couple years ago, there was just like article after article of the type I talked about earlier, of like bringing into questions like, are people rushing children into like transgendering too soon? And there are all these like moral panic articles that like were happening like post tipping point up through like the last few years that
reactionary.
I think now, and I think now people are like, when I say people, I mean like the general like cis majority. I think I'm seeing some people going like, holy crap, this is really extreme what these people are doing. And so the person who I've been obliquely talking about as like a writer about like trans related articles that were sort of moral panicky about trans healthcare. He has since come out. There's a reason why I'm not saying his name out loud.
No, don't say his name. Please don't.
Yes.
No.
I'm not saying
it.
No. Yes.
We all know.
But like he all of a sudden is like, even he is like, whoa, these bills are like way, like these.
But
these
they're quoting him. They're citing his work.
No, I know. He did this. He is part of, he helped create the environment that this is
look,
in.
I started a fire. I didn't mean not just him. No.
Yeah, but the Economist ran like a bunch of these articles. Other places did. But the point I'm making is, I think the rest of the world is now looking at this like being like, holy crap. And the way that I see it, and something that has changed in my mind, if we still have time, that I could like just say a little something more.
We have as much time as Julia Serano has.
So this is what has really struck me. And this struck me during that moral panicky time. I wrote in like 2019 I was confused. Like one of these ideas that came out of that moral panic thing, that person who we're not talking about kind of alluded to, was the idea of social contagion, like children like being
trending.
Trans trending and social contagion. I'm like, where did this come from? Where did this idea come from? And so like I literally did an investigation. I'm not really a journalist, but like I did a ton of Google searches, and what I found was the idea came from one of 3 websites that were the first 3 anti-trans parent groups that started online. And if you follow this whole thing, if you follow that timeline, and you follow what has happened ever since, was those people organized parents who, some of whom were clearly anti-trans to begin with, and who espouse like really ridiculous stuff, like no one should be able to transition until they're 25. And one of the biggest ones was started out explicitly TERF in their language and what they believe about trans people. Right around that time is when there was this organization of kind of a backlash against trans people. And so when all that stuff was happening in 2016, 17, 18, etc., like that was all organized, but most of us didn't recognize at the time. I didn't recognize at the time because I wasn't paying attention to that. But they basically organized all these anti-trans parents groups. And that is what has created this backlash, particularly with regards to legislation, of them joining with the religious right and the gender critical TERF people. Those groups already existed. And they also have kind of in their collection of people, they've picked the last few of kind of the old school trans psychologists and sexologists who have the outdated views of like we should do gender reparative therapy even though they won't call it that, and we should do stricter gatekeeping, which completely failed. And so they have this slew of people who are a minority of people, but they organized and they won over all these media groups to like put out their stuff about these moral panic pieces about transgender contagion and detransition, which detransition being a real thing, but kind of the way it gets framed is basically that almost all the people involved in that organized detransition thing are very closely related to, closely tied to a lot of anti-trans feminism. And of course, detransitioning is something a lot of people do, and a lot of people are still
I did it.
Yeah, a lot of people, I have friends who have detransitioned, but they're still involved in trans communities because even though they detransition, they're still like a part of our communities.
So I hate that they're detransitioners who are good people who are, branded with this thing, because I went through a time, so did that celebrity Caitlyn Jenner. She started on hormones and then decided I can't do this. So it happens to more people than we know. People don't generally publicize that detour that they make. And unfortunately, mine was in the mass media, so I didn't have much of a choice. But, I want to bring you good news to end on. We reported at Outsports this week that a Marist poll, also sponsored by NPR and PBS NewsHour, found that 66% of people, of both Democrats and Republicans, 69% for Democrats and 66% for Republicans, were against these laws, against trans bans. The only problem with the study was it also found that 66% of the Republicans also are against trans inclusion. So they want policies banning trans people, they just don't want laws. So that's really where the problem is that Republicans are overwhelmingly still against trans inclusion, but at least a majority of Americans from both sides of the aisle think that, bans, state laws are wrong. And that's accomplishment. That's some good news.
Yeah. And I'm starting to see some changes in the media where I think the media is just now, like they weren't about a month ago. I felt like it was like trans people are shouting in a vacuum. I think the Arkansas law, the fact that passed.
Over the veto, yeah.
Yeah, over the veto. I think people are now I'm starting to see other organizations, media organizations, mainstream media organizations start to take these laws seriously. I still don't think they completely get it. Like I see a lot of times they talk about like, oh, well, the Republicans found their wedge issue with this transgender thing. It's like, no, they actually want us to disappear. They literally want us to disappear.
Go away, trans
wedge
people.
Issue. This is just, they want us to go away. But so I feel more optimistic now than I did a month ago.
Okay.
Still dark times, but we'll see how it all plays out. I don't think that there's a majority of people in the U.S. as the poll you just said, who kind of, wants to completely demonize trans people, or completely outlaw trans healthcare, etc.
As Karleigh often reminds us, let's not forget, these are children. They're somebody's children. And we need to remember that. You're not an activist, but you are an award-winning writer, an author, a biologist, and a musician. Plus, you just happen to be a trans woman. Julia Serano, thank you for joining us in the transporter room. Karleigh, please set coordinates for Oakland, California, and live long and prosper.
Yes.
Okay,
Another thing, Julia, you got to come back.
Okay.
You have to come back, especially when we do that. We're going to do that cast reading of 99 Eric, so you got to come back.
There you go.
I'll definitely be back for that.
We'll get some Erics. I know some Erics.
Okay, we're going to beam Julia back home. Thank you.
Okay.
It was an honor. Energize.
Yeah, my honor.
Thank you. Take care. Boo, boo. Karleigh, I'll see you next week.
See you all next week. Live long and prosper, everybody.
All right. Take care.